Now, some of you may be asking, well, why would an angel, some divine being who has all this strength and ability and superhuman skill and blah, 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 like, why would they need to fly something? That's a good question. But what makes us think that our assumption where an angel can just close his eyes, snap his fingers, and appear from one place to another, what makes us think that that's how they travel? All right, what's up, everybody? Single day all over the earth. So we have to get to a place where it's no longer, are they real? But what are they? Now, I did a couple episodes last year talking about what I think aliens are. And I'm not going to get into all of that today, but I want to just do a brief summary on my take of what I think aliens are to set the stage. Now, many people, because I've got into social media wars over this, many people think that aliens are just demons. And that's what they are. It's very cut and dry. And I made a whole case where I don't think that aliens are demons. I think that aliens are demonic, but being demonic doesn't mean demon. I think they are a faction in the unseen realm in the kingdom of darkness. So you have the good guys and you have the bad guys, and the bad guys are comprised of a whole bunch of different entities and different categories of entities. And I think aliens are just one of those factions on the bad guys team. Now, a lot of people think that aliens are fallen angels. That is a conversation that I can go down. I can discuss that. To me, it's interesting, but um, I don't think they're fallen angels. Again, I think they're a different entity, but a lot of people believe that. I can go deeper into that kind of conversation. So that's my take. I think aliens, they're demonic. They're not good. I don't think there's benevolent aliens. And they're from the kingdom of darkness. So UFOs now. I'm not going to get into the entire history of UFOs. There's a ton of information out there, a ton of podcasts, a ton of videos, just a ton of literature detailing and chronicling the history of UFOs, or as they're calling them now, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon. But if you go back through the centuries, you will see there are stories and accounts of crazy aircraft wars that took place like hundreds and thousands of years ago when they weren't even supposed to exist, where airplanes weren't even created or invented to the early 1900s. But you have these records of these stories of aircrafts fighting and all that kind of stuff throughout history. And then you have tons of imagery and pictures, like hieroglyphs of what looks like UFOs being painted and drawn all over the world. And so you can go back and you can look at all of these different accounts that lends to the idea that, okay, this is not a recent thing, but it's been happening for a long period of time. So leading up to modern day, or within the last, let's say, 80, 90 years, the accounts, it seems like they've gotten more frequent and a lot more mainstream. And so I guess the most famous one, right, you have the account that happened Roswell back in, I think it was 1947, I want to say, where there was an UFO or a UAP crash landed, and it was put in the newspaper that it was some kind of strange aircraft, but then the story got switched, and then the mainstream narrative was, oh, it was just a big balloon that crashed. But when you start digging into that and you start looking at eyewitness accounts and eyewitness testimony, and you start hearing testimony from people in the military at that time, it's very evident that this was not a balloon, that was just a massive cover-up, and that there was an aircraft that did crash and they have it. And then there's been other people who have gone to the place where it crashed, in recent years, and have dug up and found remains of that aircraft. And then they've taken samples from the remains and they've analyzed it, and they've come to the conclusion that whatever this aircraft was and whatever it's made out of, it's not from Earth. And they look at it, and we don't have that type of technology. We don't have that type of material anywhere on the Earth. And so that was Roswell. And then you look throughout the decades, military accounts, where you have these fighter pilots who are out doing routine training exercises, and all of a sudden, up on their radar comes these aircraft, and they're maneuvering and they're flying at speeds and moving in ways that our modern aircraft cannot do. And then so they start following them, and they see them. They actually see them, not just on the radar, but they see them right in front of them, and then all of a sudden these things will just take off. And there's reports of military pilots seeing these UFOs coming in and out of the water. So these aren't just random dudes in their basement, claiming to have witnessed a UFO. These are like legitimate military fighter pilots who've seen it. And there's tons of these stories that can easily be found with research. Then you have last summer, you have the whole Vegas alien incident and the alien incident in Peru that I did an episode last summer and talked about both of these accounts. In those accounts, there were these reports of aircraft and technology. And then you have the biggest bomb of them all. Last summer, there was the massive disclosure event with David Grush, who sat before Congress and detailed a whole bunch of crazy information surrounding aliens, surrounding the government, surrounding what's been known and discovered. And one of those things, one of the bombs that he dropped was that he had fully admitted that the U.S. government has retrieved UAP aircraft. They have it. They've had it for decades, going back to Roswell, maybe even before that, but they have it. And so that's not myth. And there's been, and then he even goes on to say that there's been workers who have worked on this aircraft trying to re-engineer it. And during certain workers trying to re-engineer this aircraft, they've been hurt, and some of them have even died because we just have no idea how to get into this aircraft, what it's made out of, how it works together. And so during the process of trying to figure all that out, men and women have died. And so this, according to David Grush, UFOs, UAPs, they're real. We have them. We've had them for decades. And I mean, you want to keep going down this trail, there's even reports where maybe a lot of these sightings that are seen all over the world could be aircraft that's been re-engineered or reverse engineered by our government, and there are our men and women who are flying them around, these reverse engineered aircraft. So is every single UFO sighting legit? Probably not. Is every single UFO sighting an alien flying it? Probably not. Could be some of our own guys. But the point is this, is there are solid evidence now, like clear evidence that there is technology, there is these aircraft that we have that's been seen, that's been tracked, that's been retrieved, that's not from this earth. And so this is where, as Christians, our paradigm has to shift. Because you can't just say, oh, it's not real, that's fake. Because it's not. It's no longer, are they real, but it's what are they? Where does it come from? What's the story behind it? And if, as Christians, if we're too close-minded, if we're too wrapped up in a nice cookie cutter theology that's nice and safe, and we don't allow for anything that may seek to break the little box, we're going to miss out on a lot of conversations and a lot of influence that we can have in our modern culture, because this stuff is real and it's happening. And a lot of people have questions. And so we have to at least be able to have a conversation. We have to at least be able to engage in dialogue. And we can't just say, oh, it's not real. Like that approach is useless now. And it's outdated and it's antiquated and you can't do it anymore. There's just too much stuff now that's come out. And so one of the areas that we have to, as we're wrestling with this, is that of divine technology, if you will. See, because we have this crazy technology, these aircraft, that's not from this world and can only be driven or predominantly be driven by beings, divine beings that are not of this world. And so we have to wrap our mind around that idea that who's flying these things. And this is where we get into the alien talk. So you have these UAPs, these UFOs. Maybe some of them have been reverse engineered, but the bulk of them probably haven't, because dude admitted that guys and women have been killed trying to reverse engineer it. So who's flying them? And this is where we get into a bit of alien talk. And as I mentioned earlier, they're not demons. They're demonic, but they're not demons. And so I just want to quickly go through some of the types of aliens that's been reported that potentially could be flying these different kinds of UAPs or UFOs. And so the most common alien that's often described during encounters that people have with them are called the Greys. And these are those aliens with the big heads, the almond-shaped dark eyes, long fingers, and a lot of times people will see them as really short, 3-4 feet tall perhaps, but then some people have reported seeing them taller. But they all have that same kind of typical look when you think of an alien. And so that's the common belief, is that these are the guys that typically are flying these aircraft, these UFOs and these UAPs. But then we get into these other kinds of aliens that have been reported and that people have had encounters with, and one is the insectolins. Now again, I understand how a lot of this stuff may sound, especially if you've never heard it before. I remember the first time I started digging into this stuff. Man, it's not an easy pill to swallow, but just don't tune me out here. You have the insectolins, and these are the kind of creatures that look very much like praying mantises, insects like insectolins. They have that kind of praying mantis look to them, just on a way more massive scale. And certain people would suggest that these are the leaders of the Greys. The Greys are like the bottom level guys. The insectolins are kind of like their boss. But they've been known to fly the UAPs as well. Then you have draconians, and you have reptilians, and then you have the Nordics. And these are in a lot of reports of, I think, Norse mythology, where these are the tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed kind of beings that are in all of those folklore, but they are also seen as aliens. Now, clearly look way different. And then you have this human alien hybrid. And so this is another rabbit hole and another episode, but there has been this hybridization project that's been happening for decades, where, according to a lot of different reports, the U.S. government made a pact with the aliens that in exchange for technology, we'll give you people, and again, we'll get into this in the next episode in the whole abduction thing. But the whole point is, a lot of the reason why these abductions happen is these aliens are trying to take our DNA, splicing our DNA. They're trying to ultimately create a perfect human alien hybrid that is undetectable. So a lot of people would suggest that right now, walking among us are human alien hybrids, and these guys could perhaps be flying, operating UAPs as well. So these are different types. And again, this is not exhaustive, but I wanted to point this out because a lot of these names and a lot of these ideas, they're out there in random parts, and sometimes it can be confusing. But these are the guys that typically are seen to be flying this aircraft. Now, I want to ask this question or put forth another theory here. So we have UFOs, UAPs. We have this technology that's not from this world. You have these different types of beings, different types of quote unquote aliens that are not from this world. Now, there's theories that have been put forth that ask the question, well, why is it only bad divine beings, those on the dark side, that are flying this technology around? Why can't good angels or entities from the good side, kingdom of God side, operate these UAPs as well? And could it be that perhaps a lot of, or some of these sightings are not actually aliens, but they're actually members of God's team flying them around? Now, and again, I know this may sound insane to a lot of you, especially if you've never heard of that, but we have to have it in our paradigm to talk about and include, divine technology. See, because oftentimes when we think about heaven, right, we just think of gold streets and there's a throne and there may be some rivers there and mansions, but like we don't actually stop to think about like, what is heaven going to be like? Like, what could actually be there? And if there are mansions, how did they get built? What are they made out of? Like, we're not going to be floating around as these invisible, disembodied spirits. We're actually going to have a resurrected body. We're actually going to be in a literal place. And when God created the unseen realm, which was created before the earth, and I talked about this in the last episode, the whole pre-Adamic world and that theory and the angels and the whole divine, all the divine beings were already created prior to humanity. We don't know how long that they may have existed prior to God creating the earth. So what's happening in that world? Could there be technology that exists in that dimension, in that space, in the unseen realm? And so is it possible that there are UAPs that exist in the unseen realm, not just from aliens, but just in general? Because they had to be created somewhere. And if they weren't created on the earth, they didn't come from the earth, then they have to have come from somewhere. And could it be? As crazy as that sounds, let that just sink in. Now some of you may be asking, well, why would an angel, some divine being who has all this strength and ability and superhuman skill and blah, 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 like, why would they need to fly something? That's a good question. But what makes us think that our assumption where an angel can just close his eyes, snap his fingers, and appear from one place to another, what makes us think that that's how they travel? I mean, in the scriptures, it'll say an angel shows up to a person. The angel showed up to Mary. We don't know how he got there. He could have, like, who's to say he didn't come down and a certain aircraft landed undetected, walked in and appeared to Mary. Like I'm just saying, like, we don't know that. We just assume that he just all of a sudden pop out of nowhere, just there he is. When the angels appeared to Abraham before Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham said he saw them walking in the distance. Well, how'd they get there? See, we just assume that they just magically appear. Now, could that be true? Sure, it could be true. But there's no evidence that suggests that that's how they operate and that's what they do. So we've just assumed that. But maybe they do fly stuff around. Like this whole idea, like I've been wrestling with this and thinking about this for a while. And I know it sounds crazy, and I'm not saying it's completely true. I'm just having this dialogue. I'm open to having this dialogue and discussion because look at where we're at as a culture. Look what's happening. We can't just turn a blind eye to what's being discovered. And this is why it's scary for Christians if they don't open up their paradigm. It's going to really mess with you because we've had this cookie cutter, nice, easy, safe theology that we like, that's comfortable. But what if there's so much more that we don't know? And we have to be open. And so I want to conclude now, spend the remainder of our time talking about some verses that potentially could be talking about this kind of divine aerial technology. Not saying this is thus saith the Lord, not saying that this is exactly what it is, because there's a lot of people who I respect and scholars who would look at these texts and say this is absolutely not what the text is saying. And then there's others who look at this text who love Jesus, who are brilliant men and women thinkers, and they would say, it's a possibility. So this is, again, I'm just having a conversation. I just want us to consider. And so we have, we'll look at a few different verses here. And so the main one, I guess the most common one that can be referred to as potentially some kind of a divine aerial aircraft here is Ezekiel chapter 1 in the vision that Ezekiel gets. Now, I'm not going to read through the entire 30 verses there. I'm just going to highlight some parts. Now, we have to understand this too. These ancient writers, when they get these visions and they're describing things, they're describing something that they probably have never seen. And so they're trying to write down what they saw that maybe they've never seen, but are only using words and ideas and concepts that they know at that time in their particular context. So imagine someone from today could time travel. They go back in time to 1800 and they take this iPad right here and they show someone in the 1800s this iPad. And then you tell that person, now I want you to explain this iPad to one of your friends. What are they going to say? In 1800s, right there, obviously there's no phones, there's no electronics. None of that existed. So they're looking at it, this object that they can see words on, that they can swipe and like how would they describe an iPad to one of their friends when they don't even have verbiage and understanding of what this is? This is kind of like what happens in the Bible a lot with the writers, especially with Ezekiel here. He is potentially seeing something that he's never seen before, but he can only use words, again, concepts and ideas that he has at his disposal based on his knowledge and intellect and context. So let's keep that in mind. And so we have in verse 4, we see the phrase, something as he's describing what he is seeing, something that resembles gleaming metal. He sees this thing approaching and it resembles gleaming metal. Interesting. In the verses 5 to 15, he talks about these creatures, the cherubim, right, with the 4 faces, and that have the appearance of coals of fire, and they have the appearance of torches, moving back and forth that also move with kind of a robotic syncretism and they also have wings. Now, I heard a preacher talk about this text in context of talking about a UFO, and he says, if someone were to ask you right now, what do you think of when you think of the word wing? What pops into your mind? And so I was like, if someone says to me the word wing, I'm thinking of an airplane wing. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. Now, why is that? Well, because that's a normal cultural contextual truth. We have airplanes, an airplane wing. Now, back then, airplanes didn't exist. So what if Ezekiel is seeing something that resembled a wing that would be on a craft, but he'd never seen that? How would you describe it? Well, he'd describe it because in the text it says that the angels, or that these cherubim had their wings, the two wings, and they were all touching each other. And so it created this one long, massive wing. Now, what if that was a way for him to describe what he was seeing, using verbiage that he only has based on his context? It's just something to think about. And then again, it says they had the appearance. It looked like they had like coals of fire and torches moving back and forth. Like, it had the appearance of it. He's just saying, this is what it looked like to me, and he's only using words and ideas that he has at his disposal. Then you have verses 16 to 21. It talks about this whole wheel within a wheel thing. Now, in our modern context, a wheel within a wheel, what's that? Well, that could be a gyroscope. They're what is in our aircraft, and gyroscopes, they don't have to turn. They can move in and out, left, right, up and down. They don't have to turn. That's how they operate. Well, that's what's being described here. It's a giant wheel within a wheel. And then it has eyes all around it. Eyes. Again, now, if you're looking at this through an open mind, what could that mean? Is he talking about literal eyes, eyeballs? Or if you've never seen flashing lights around a wheel-shaped structure, what would you call that back then? Like, you see, it kind of makes sense. Like, oh, we saw all these flashing lights, these lights all around it. It looks like eyes that were around the wheel. You know what I mean? Like, this is him trying to potentially describe something he's never seen. And then in verse 16, it talks about, we have the phrase, the wheel in their workings, or the wheel in their construction. And when you do some digging into the original Hebrew here, it can suggest it's talking about something mechanical here. It's talking about the mechanical structure of these wheels. Speaking of mechanics, it's just interesting. And then you have verses 22 to 28 talk about God's throne. That's gleaming metal. It's like it's described as jasper and full of jewels and colors. And then you have all of these wheels underneath it, these wheel within a wheel things. And there's been a lot of artist renditions of what this potentially could have looked like. Some of them look really cool. Some of them look really, really jacked up. But here's the point. Not saying that this is exactly what it is, but I'm just saying through the lens of ancient eyes who don't have the verbiage and the understanding to communicate something that they've never seen, can only do so or attempt to do so with the knowledge and the context that they're in. And it could be that. It could be. It's an option. It's something to think about. You don't have to believe it. A lot of people don't believe it. A lot of scholars would look at that and say that's nonsense. Others look at that and say it's plausible. And I'm just saying. So that's Ezekiel chapter 1. 2 Kings 6. This is the story of Elijah and his servant when their enemy was approaching and the servant's freaking out. And Elijah prays, he's like, God, open his eyes, help him to see that there is more who are for us than against us. And then all of a sudden, God opens up the servant's eyes, and it was like he just saw this was a massive army of chariots and horses on fire all around. And what's interesting is that word chariot, and we see it all through the Bible. The Hebrew word for chariot is a word called, I don't want to butcher this, Merkava. And what's interesting is this is what Israel right now, this is the word that they have for their tank. They call their tanks Merkava. So you have chariot all throughout the Hebrew Bible. Every word for chariot is called Merkava. And you have Israel calling their tanks Merkava. Now that word Merkava comes from the root word meaning to ride, to mount, or to climb. So to ride or to mount. Now, some scholars would suggest that when the text says chariot, oftentimes it means a literal chariot that they rode, but it can also mean just another way of saying a vehicle, something that one rides to get from point A to point B. And so perhaps not every single instance does it literally mean chariot. So is what Elijah's saying here, or what the text saying, that in heaven, the heavenly host ride around in actual ancient chariots using horses, but they're just on fire. That's what they ride around. So is that what it's saying? Or could it be that the writer is looking at this stuff and he's like, I don't know what the heck I'm seeing, but it's some kind of a vehicle that's on fire that these divine beings, God's heavenly host, is riding around. It's what they're using to get from point A to point B. It's a vehicle. Something that's ridden. I don't know. Something to think about. Is it literal chariots and horses? Or is it just some kind of UAP? And then the last example we'll look at is Zechariah 5:1, where it talks about a flying scroll. A flying scroll. And then it's given certain dimensions. And if you break out the dimensions here, the size of this flying scroll would be 30 by 15 feet. 30 feet long, 15 feet wide. Now, in a ton of these UAP or UFO sightings, there are these cigar-shaped or circular-shaped aircraft that's seen. If you're an ancient writer and you're looking and you see a cigar-shaped or tube-shaped aircraft flying around, what would you call it? You look to those eyes, it could potentially look like a flying scroll. So this is why, again, some people could look at that and say, interesting. Is he actually seeing a flying scroll? One of the ancient manuscripts that are rolled up? Is that what he's actually seeing? A 30 by 15 foot flying piece of papyrus flying around? Or could it be that that's how it was described using the verbiage and the context of their day? So those are just 3 examples from the Bible where you can make the case, or you can at least approach the subject from a biblical perspective. Now, to put this all together, again, this is a very it's a it's a subject and a topic that I never thought I would ever be talking about, ever. But we find ourselves here, and we see what's happening in our culture. We are being told that, and from verified sources and accounts, that there is these aircraft and beings that are not from Earth that exist, that are here. And so what do we do with that? And so when we look at these verses and we look at the text, here's the thing: at the very minimum, something is going on. I mean, these are crazy visions. Ezekiel's vision and Zechariah, and then in 2 Kings with Elijah. I mean, these are, at minimum, they're very weird. What's actually going on here? But then on the other side, I mean, they could be ways of describing something that's unbelievable, something that they've never seen. And when you weigh that to all of the stuff that's coming out, that's been disclosed, and you look at all the accounts and you look at all the sightings, I mean, literally there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sightings from verified sources, not just some random person in their basement on some shaky cell phone from 1982. So we have to do something with this. We have to, at least in our paradigms, make room to have dialogue and discussion. And I think that's what God's been doing with me over the last number of years. Is He spent a lot of time smashing my paradigm and rebuilding it, and smashing it and rebuilding it, and smashing it and rebuilding it, so that I can at least entertain ideas and concepts. I may not have to agree with everything, and I don't agree with everything, but I'm at least in a place where I'm able to have a discussion. And that's what's important. And so that's what I want to leave you with, is in this whole situation, this whole topic that we looked at today, is just, we need to get to a place where you can have a discussion about it. Don't just reject it. Don't just dismiss it. Don't just say, oh, it's false, it's conspiracy, it's not real, because that statement is no longer viable in light of what's been happening and what is happening. And as Christians, we have a worldview that has divine beings in it. We have a book that's filled with crazy stories. I think sometimes we forget of what we actually believe, what is actually already in our nice little tight theological box is already filled with some crazy stuff. So then it shouldn't be that much of a stretch to be able to have a conversation about these other things. And so ask God to make room in your paradigm, because there's a world of people out there who have questions. And if the church is too busy ignoring, refuting, not acknowledging, then they're going to get their answers from somewhere else. And then I guarantee you, whatever those answers are going to lead them on a path away from Jesus. So that's episode 27, the Bible, UFOs, and Aliens. Hope you enjoyed it. You learned something. Hope you were able to consider some things that maybe you've never considered before. So feel free to leave comments. Feel free to send me an email. Let's talk about it. And thanks so much for listening, watching, and we'll see you all in episode 28. Much love, and God bless.